In the weeks following 9/11, as America reeled from the worst terrorist attack in its history, a new terror began arriving in the mail. Letters filled with anthrax spores targeted journalists, senators, and postal workers, killing 5 people and exposing thousands more to deadly bacteria. The FBI launched the largest bioterrorism investigation in U.S. history, codenamed Amerithrax, ultimately concluding that the attacks were carried out by Dr. Bruce Ivins, a government scientist working inside America's own bioweapons program. But many questions remain unanswered about whether Ivins acted alone or was part of a larger conspiracy. The first anthrax letter arrived on September 18, 2001, just 1 week after the Twin Towers fell. The target was the American Media Incorporated building in Boca Raton, Florida, where tabloid newspapers like the National Enquirer and the Star were published. The envelope, addressed to Jennifer Lopez in care of the Sun tabloid, contained a fine white powder that would later be identified as weapons-grade anthrax spores. Robert Stevens, a 63-year-old photo editor with graying hair and a gentle demeanor, had been working at American Media, Inc. for over a decade. On that September morning, Stevens was handling mail in the building's mailroom when he unknowingly inhaled anthrax spores that had leaked from the contaminated envelope. Within days, Stevens developed flu-like symptoms that rapidly progressed to breathing difficulties and fever. Stevens was rushed to JFK Medical Center in Atlantis, Florida, where Dr. Larry Bush, a 45-year-old infectious disease specialist with brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses, was initially puzzled by his patient's symptoms. When Stevens's condition deteriorated rapidly and tests revealed rod-shaped bacteria in his spinal fluid, Dr. Bush made a diagnosis that would change the course of American history: inhalational anthrax, the first case seen in the United States in over 25 years. On October 5, 2001, Robert Stevens died, becoming the first victim of what would become known as the anthrax attacks. His death sent shockwaves through a nation already traumatized by the September 11th terrorist attacks, raising fears that America was under biological warfare assault by foreign terrorists. But Stevens's death was only the beginning. More anthrax letters were being prepared and mailed to high-profile targets across the country. On September 18th and October 9th, 2001, letters containing anthrax spores were sent to major news organizations and prominent political figures, including NBC News anchor Tom Brokaw, CBS News anchor Dan Rather, ABC News, The New York Post, and Democratic Senators Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy. Tom Brokaw, the 61-year-old NBC News anchor with silver hair and authoritative presence, received his anthrax letter at NBC's offices in New York City. When assistant Casey Chamberlain, a 38-year-old blonde woman working in Brokaw's office, opened the letter on October 12th. She was exposed to anthrax spores that had leaked from the envelope. Chamberlain developed cutaneous anthrax, a less deadly form of the disease that caused painful skin lesions. The letter sent to Brokaw contained a handwritten message that would become infamous. September 11th, 2001, you cannot stop us. We have this anthrax. You die now. Are you afraid? Death to America. Death to Israel. Allah is great. The crude handwriting and broken English were clearly designed to suggest foreign terrorist authorship, but forensic experts would later discover that the letters had been mailed from a mailbox in Princeton, New Jersey. Senator Tom Daschle, the 54-year-old Democratic Majority Leader with receding brown hair and a serious demeanor, received his anthrax letter at his Senate office in the Hart Senate Office Building on October 15, 2001. When Grant Leslie, a 43-year-old Daschle aide with dark hair, opened the letter, a cloud of fine white powder poured out, exposing him and other staff members to highly refined anthrax spores. The anthrax in the Dashel letter was particularly sophisticated, so finely milled that it floated through the air like talcum powder, making it extremely dangerous to inhale. This level of refinement required advanced laboratory techniques and suggested that whoever had prepared the anthrax possessed significant expertise in biological weapons development. The letters sent to senators contained a slightly different message. September 11th, 2001. You cannot stop us. We have this anthrax. You die now. Are you afraid? Death to America, death to Israel. Allah is great. Despite the apparent Islamic extremist rhetoric, investigators would later determine that the handwriting analysis and linguistic patterns suggested the letters were written by someone trying to disguise their true identity and deflect suspicion toward foreign terrorists. As the letters moved through the U.S. postal system, they contaminated mail processing facilities and exposed postal workers to deadly anthrax spores. Thomas Morris, Jr., a 55-year-old African-American postal worker with graying hair working at the Brentwood Mail Processing Facility in Washington, D.C., began developing flu-like symptoms in mid-October after handling mail contaminated with anthrax spores that had leaked from the letters. Morris, along with his colleague Joseph Curseen, Jr., a 47-year-old African-American postal supervisor with a mustache and gentle manner, sought medical treatment as their symptoms worsened. However, initial medical examinations failed to diagnose their condition as anthrax exposure, and both men were sent home with instructions to rest and take over-the-counter medications. On October 21st and 22nd, 2001, both Morris and Curseen died from inhalational anthrax, becoming the second and third victims of the attacks. Their deaths highlighted the vulnerability of postal workers and the deadly nature of the refined anthrax being used in the attacks. Kathy Nguyen, a 61-year-old Vietnamese-American hospital worker with short black hair working at Manhattan Eye, Ear, and Throat Hospital, became the fourth victim of the anthrax attacks. Nguyen had no known connection to the media organizations or government offices that had received anthrax letters, and investigators never determined how she was exposed to the deadly spores. She died on October 31st, 2001, after developing inhalational anthrax from an unknown source. Ottilie Lundgren, a 94-year-old widow with white hair living in Oxford, Connecticut, became the fifth and final victim of the attacks. Lundgren, who lived a quiet life and rarely left her home, died on November 21st, 2001, from inhalational anthrax. Like Nguyen, investigators could never definitively determine how Lundgren was exposed to anthrax, though they suspected cross-contamination from mail processed at facilities that had handled the anthrax letters. The FBI launched Operation Amerithrax, the largest bioterrorism investigation in U.S. history, under the leadership of Special Agent in Charge Richard Lambert, a 52-year-old veteran investigator with brown hair and intense focus. Lambert and his team faced the daunting task of identifying the perpetrator of attacks that had killed 5 people, infected 17 others, and terrorized a nation already traumatized by 9/11. Initial investigations focused on foreign terrorist organizations, particularly Al-Qaeda, which had carried out the September 11th attacks. The timing of the anthrax letters, coming just weeks after 9/11, and the Islamic extremist rhetoric in the letters seemed to point to international terrorism. However, scientific analysis of the anthrax spores would lead investigators in a completely different direction. Dr. Paul Keem, a 58-year-old geneticist with graying hair and glasses working at Northern Arizona University, conducted genetic analysis of the anthrax samples and made a startling discovery. The anthrax used in the attacks came from the Ames strain, a particular variety of anthrax that was used primarily in U.S. biodefense research. More significantly, the specific genetic markers in the attack anthrax matched samples that had originated at the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, USAMRIID, at Fort Detrick, Maryland. This revelation shifted the FBI's investigation from foreign terrorism to domestic bioterrorism, focusing on scientists and researchers who had access to the Ames strain anthrax at U.S. government laboratories. The list of potential suspects was relatively small. Fewer than 100 people had the necessary access, knowledge, and opportunity to have carried out the attacks. Dr. Stephen Hatfill, a 48-year-old microbiologist with brown hair and a goatee, initially became the FBI's prime suspect. Hatfill had worked as a biodefense researcher and had access to anthrax samples during his career. FBI agents conducted highly publicized searches of his apartment, followed him constantly, and named him a person of interest in the investigation. However, after years of investigation and surveillance, the FBI was unable to find evidence linking Hatfill to the attacks. In 2008, the Justice Department agreed to pay Hatfill $5.8 million to settle his lawsuit, claiming the FBI had destroyed his reputation and career through their aggressive and ultimately unfounded investigation. As the Hatfill investigation stalled, FBI attention turned to Dr. Bruce Ivins, a 56-year-old microbiologist with thinning brown hair, glasses, and a quiet demeanor who had worked at USAMRIID for over 28 years. Ivins was considered one of the nation's leading experts on anthrax and had spent his career developing vaccines to protect American soldiers from biological weapons attacks. Ivins had access to the specific flask of Ames strain anthrax that genetic testing had identified as the source of the attack material. More concerning to investigators, Ivins had been working unusual hours in the laboratory during the period when the anthrax letters would have been prepared. Security records showed that Ivins had spent long hours alone in the laboratory during evenings and weekends in September and October 2001, with no documented research justification for the overtime. Dr. Ivins had a history of mental health issues, including depression and obsessive-compulsive behaviors. He had undergone psychological counseling and had been prescribed antidepressant medications. As FBI pressure intensified, Ivins's mental state deteriorated further, and he began expressing paranoid thoughts about government surveillance and conspiracies against him. The investigation revealed disturbing aspects of Ivins's personal life, including an obsession with the Kappa Kappa Gamma sorority that dated back to his college years. The anthrax letters had been mailed from Princeton, New Jersey, near the location of a Kappa Kappa Gamma office. Investigators theorized that Ivins's psychological fixation on the sorority might have influenced his choice of mailing location. As the FBI prepared to file charges against Ivins in 2008, the pressure of the investigation and impending arrest proved too much for the 56-year-old scientist. On July 29, 2008, Ivins committed suicide by taking an overdose of acetaminophen at his home in Frederick, Maryland. His death ended any possibility of a trial that might have definitively established his guilt or innocence. Following Ivins's suicide, the FBI officially closed the Amerithrax investigation and released a detailed report concluding that Ivins had acted alone in carrying out the anthrax attacks. According to the FBI's final assessment, Ivins had been motivated by fears that his anthrax vaccine research program would be canceled and by psychological issues that had driven him to commit bioterrorism against his own country. However, the FBI's conclusions have been challenged by many experts, including some of Ivins' colleagues at USAMRIID, who insisted that he lacked the equipment and expertise necessary to produce the highly refined anthrax found in the letters. Dr. Jeffrey Adamovich, a 62-year-old former USAMRIID scientist with gray hair who had worked with Ivins, argued that the level of sophistication in the attack anthrax suggested involvement of multiple individuals or access to specialized equipment that Ivins didn't possess. The National Academy of Sciences conducted an independent review of the FBI's scientific evidence and concluded in 2011 that while the genetic evidence linked the attack anthrax to Ivins' flask, this didn't necessarily prove that Ivins himself had carried out the attacks. The review noted that other researchers had access to material from the same flask and that the FBI's case against Ivins was largely circumstantial. Some investigators and experts have suggested that the anthrax attacks might have been carried out by a team of conspirators rather than a lone individual, possibly involving scientists from multiple institutions or even foreign intelligence services. The sophisticated refinement of the anthrax, the timing of the attacks, and the apparent insider knowledge of U.S. biodefense programs have led to speculation about more complex conspiracy scenarios. The anthrax attacks had profound effects on American biodefense policy and postal security procedures. The attacks exposed critical vulnerabilities in mail processing systems and led to massive investments in biodefense research and detection capabilities. The federal government spent billions of dollars upgrading laboratory facilities, developing new vaccines and treatments, and establishing emergency response protocols for biological attacks. The attacks also raised disturbing questions about the security of U.S. biological weapons research programs and the psychological screening of scientists working with deadly pathogens. The revelation that the attack materials had originated from a U.S. government laboratory highlighted the potential for insider threats within the biodefense community and led to enhanced security measures at research facilities. Dr. Tara O'Toole, a 65-year-old biosecurity expert with gray hair who served as Undersecretary for Science and Technology at the Department of Homeland Security, noted that the anthrax attacks demonstrated how a small amount of biological material could cause massive disruption and terror. The attacks shut down government buildings, disrupted mail service, and required extensive decontamination efforts that cost hundreds of millions of dollars. The families of the anthrax victims continue to seek answers about the attacks and justice for their loved ones. Maureen Stevens, Robert Stevens' widow, filed lawsuits against the government alleging that inadequate security at biodefense laboratories had enabled the attacks. The families have questioned whether Bruce Ivins truly acted alone and whether the full truth about the attacks has been revealed. The Amerithrax investigation cost over $100 million and involved hundreds of FBI agents working for 7 years, making it one of the most expensive and lengthy criminal investigations in U.S. history. Despite this massive effort, many questions about the attacks remain unanswered, and the case continues to generate controversy and conspiracy theories. Today, the anthrax attacks serve as a reminder of America's vulnerability to bioterrorism and the potential for weapons of mass destruction to be used by individuals or small groups against civilian populations. The attacks demonstrated that sophisticated biological weapons could be developed and deployed without the resources of a nation-state, fundamentally changing how security experts assess bioterrorism threats. The case also highlighted the challenges of investigating bioterrorism cases, where scientific evidence must be combined with traditional criminal investigation techniques to identify perpetrators. The complexity of biological forensics and the small number of experts qualified to conduct such investigations pose ongoing challenges for law enforcement agencies preparing for future bioterrorism incidents. The legacy of the anthrax attacks continues to influence American security policy, scientific research protocols, and emergency preparedness planning. The attacks served as a wake-up call about the potential for biological weapons to be used on American soil and the critical importance of maintaining security around dangerous pathogens and research materials. Whether Bruce Ivins acted alone, as the FBI concluded, or whether the attacks involved a broader conspiracy may never be definitively determined. But the 5 people who died, Robert Stevens, Thomas Morris Jr., Joseph Kursine Jr., Kathy Nguyen, and Ottilie Lundgren, remain victims of what was either the work of a lone, disturbed scientist or a more complex plot that exploited America's own biodefense capabilities to terrorize the nation in its moment of greatest vulnerability following 9/11.